Well, welcome everybody. This is the first of a series of In Conversation With. Tonight, we're going to be talking to our very own bass trombone player extraordinaire and composer in residence, Adam Dutch, off the back of the recent discussions that Adam and I have both done individually about composing and improvising. And as we embarked on those a few weeks ago and ran a series of little talks about that, we discovered there was an awful lot of parallels and correlations between the improvising musician, myself primarily jazz, and working as a composer. And Adam's mainly I think it's fair to say you're mainly a composer of wind band music.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So we just discovered that and you'll realise this if you've seen the programme, we discovered there's an awful lot of correlation, a lot of similarities about what we're talking about. So we're going to discuss our various approaches between improvising and what I would call composing in real time, to actually sitting down with a score and composing and writing it down and producing the parts for the band. Is there anything you'd like to add to that intro, Adam, or do you think that sums it up?
No, I think that's pretty fair. I mean, I've always viewed improvisation as composing in real time, and I think Sarah and I were chatting about this over dinner, and we were saying the big difference for me is when I compose, over a set of chords, I can hear a melody. The big difference is being able to transfer that to an instrument, which is obviously what improvisation is. You hear something and then transfer it to an instrument. Whereas I might not necessarily transfer that to an instrument, and I don't have to do it in real time. I've got the luxury of being able to refine those ideas and kind of, progress different avenues that arise from there.
Yeah. What I've found is I've composed in the past, but I find composing quite a time-consuming pursuit, really. And when I try and write down my own solos, I find that quite difficult. Actually, it's almost like transcribing your own stuff. And sometimes I'll end up writing it out. Or occasionally, I've been quite honoured to find that students of mine have transcribed my own solos, and then they send them back to me, and I go, goodness me, how on earth did I play that? I think I couldn't play it if it was written down half the time. And you think, gosh, that's really tricky. I suppose one of the first things I talk to students about when improvising is this idea of structure, sequence, and pattern. And I think those three things run through both improvisation and composition, don't they? Because without structure or sequence or pattern, it becomes free jazz, which is jazz that nobody wants to pay to listen to. Or this idea of not having that kind of sequence there doesn't fit very well with the human ear. So when I'm improvising, I do try and think about the structure of a solo in the same way I think that a composer would think about a structure of a piece. We talk about trying to tell a story through structure. So if I'm going to play a few choruses on a jazz standard, I'll perhaps start off quite sparse, build up, and maybe build up to a climax and stop, or build up to a climax and tail away again, depending on the style of the music and the sort of conversational development within the ensemble. Maybe you could tell us a little bit how you approach the structure of your compositions, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I mentioned this in my talk. I came across a YouTuber I follow called Adam Neely, and he has this phrase, which is repetition enforces legitimacy. And I think quite often composers will rely on standard forms. So, for example, I mean, it's no surprise that a pop song, verse, chorus form, is one of the most successful popular forms of music that relies on repetition, the repetition of the verse and the chorus.
And of course, that's just the same for a jazz standard, because don't forget, these tunes I'm playing from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they were the pop songs of the day, and they have their A section, if you want to call it that, or 8 bars, middle 8, A again. So it's a very similar kind of progression, isn't it?
Yeah, and even if you're listening to something that's through composed, so for example, film music doesn't necessarily fit into a traditional structure in terms of here's your first section, here's your second section, because it's marrying what's going on the screen. But even then, that relies very heavily on the use of motifs and themes and melody, and repetition there is built up melodically. So, you know, you hit it right on the head before when you said the human ear craves that kind of the thing that it recognizes and the thing it keeps coming back to. And you know, you'll know when you're improvising, particularly, you know, if you're trading, you might hear something that someone else plays and you're like, I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to use what they've done and build upon that idea. And part of it is because you like it, and part of it's because it's something that's come before.
That's right. Often when you follow another soloist, you pick up on what they've finished playing in their first, in their final chorus, and you know, as you pick up your solo, it's nice to take that on and carry on that idea. So if they finish with ba ba doo ba doo ba doo ba doo ba doo bab, you could pick up with ba ba doo ba doo ba da ba doo ba doo ba da bab, you know, and just sort of augment that idea, perhaps either rhythmically or melodically. And the idea of this through composed thing, you know, thinking about motifs, we do that with jazz as well. You get the same kind of, there's little riffs and licks, sometimes I call them, you know, we think of them as motifs. And it's always nice, I find, to take them through a sequence. So if you go ba-da-doo-dee-doo, ba-da-da-dee-da, ba-da-da-da-da, which is Beauty and the Beast. That's one of my little licks, you know, ba-ba-doo-doo, ba-ba-da-ba-da, ba-ba-da-ba-da. And you take that and you get a sequence. And the ear likes that because it's not just given one little chunk of melody and then left it alone and never returned back to it. So everything becomes related to what you've just played. You know, so if I'm improvising, every new idea I play is related to something that's come before it. Would you say that's true in your compositional style?
Yeah, I think it's true of all composers, really. I think you know, I was watching a video before of Michael Giacchino, who's a famous film composer, composed these to Up and various other things, and he was talking about.
Did he do The Incredibles?
He did do The Incredibles, yes.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the way he approaches composition, because, and this will lead on to a question that you asked me the other day about, do you start with the chords or do you start with the melody? And Giacchino was talking about starting with one musical idea, and that one musical idea could be melodic, it could be harmonic, it could be whatever. And the example he gave was the music of Up. So his motivation for the entire score from Up was a C major 7 chord, and everything thematically in that film is built from that major set, those 4 notes of that major 7 chord. Ba da da da. So it's, you know, 7 octaves, 7 fifth. You know, and everything there was built from that kind of that home base, and that's, you know, composers approach things very differently. You know, sometimes I'll do a similar thing. I'll go, oh, I really like this kind of sound world. What can I do to stay in there? Other times it'll be very melodic. It'll be driven by a melody, and I'll go, okay, that's kind of the melody. And then, but when you're then developing your melody, you're going, right, what did I do in that first melody? And that might be a sequence. It might be an interval. How can I then develop that into something that sounds connected to what's come before? Because it's got to sound connected. Otherwise, the listener's going to go, what's going on here? Why is this piece of music not flowing?
It sounds like a piece of Schumann or something, you know, who famously, you know, writes 2 very different things and kind of awkwardly copies and pastes them together, doesn't he?
Exactly,
you know? Yeah, and that ties in with the idea of the sort of sequence of things, and the fact that one idea leads on to the next, and you get that structure and that kind of storytelling either through the improvisation or the composition, you know, and the music doesn't stagnate, then it grows from an initial idea. When I'm teaching improvisation, often the first place to start is just with a rhythm, you know, so you take pitch out of it completely, and over whatever chord sequence you're working on, you know, maybe just playing the root, you think about something rhythmically. And sometimes I encourage students to either write out a rhythm or play a rhythm over a whole chorus of chords, to think of some rhythmic development, you know, and usually again sort of starting simpler and building up. And then once you've got a nice shape to the rhythms, then think about putting the pitch in. So that's sort of the opposite to that Up idea of starting with pitch. Do you ever think like that rhythmically at all?
So, yes, but I tend to. It comes out of melodic invention. I I don't often. So when I write music and when I'm orchestrating, always pretty much the last thing I'll write is the percussion, and the last thing I'll write. And I know that's not strictly just rhythmic on its own, but I tend to think melodically first. So actually, a lot of the time when I sketch stuff, it might be rhythmically quite stagnant. It might be rhythmically just kind of, here's a semi-brief of a chord, and then the melody. I tend to think in terms of blocks and then a melody over the top.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I'm improvising, I think the number one thing I'm thinking about is rhythm and
Okay.
pitch. And then obviously with jazz in that setting, swing and things, I'll be thinking about the syncopation.
Yeah.
So often I think more about the rhythmic ideas than the pitch, and the pitch kind of takes on its own world and takes care of itself in as such as I know my way around the chord shapes and symbols, and I can allow my kind of creative brain to take over with the pitch. But I definitely think very carefully about the rhythm, particularly when I'm going to start a phrase,
Yeah.
because I'm trying to start on a syncopated part of the bar. One ba da ba ba do ba do bap is a typical kind of bebop thing. So I probably think about that a little bit more than the pitch, I think.
I think rhythm comes for me after I've had the initial melodic and harmonic ideas. And then it's like, okay, how do I then create the rhythmic interest on top of that? And it might be, often it'll be, the melodic interest will come from the melody. So quite often there might be a chord or whatever, and I'll go, okay, so that could go, da 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 da. In which case, that rhythmic idea, I'm going, okay, I want to hit on 4 ba da da ba ba or whatever.
Yeah.
And a lot of the kind of orchestrational rhythmic material comes out of that melodic, and I suppose that's a key difference. And I find this from when I play bass, particularly when I'm accompanying someone who's improvising. Our rhythmic ideas in a rhythm section a lot of the time come from the rhythmic ideas that you're playing as the melody instrument. So, we'll take our lead from what you're doing rhythmically.
Yes.
And I think it's kind of the same when I'm composing. Once that rhythm is there in the melody, then the accompaniment can follow what the melody is doing rhythmically.
That's interesting because when I have composed, and not that I'm prolific in any way, but I tend to think, I think like a jazz musician as I compose.
Yeah.
So I think in chords and rhythmic accompaniment. So I'm a big fan of anything with triplets in or 12/8 kind of Superman-y Pirates of the Caribbean Holst Mars kind of 5/4 dum da 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 dum dum da 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 dum da dum digga da 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 da. I think, oh, okay, I like that rhythm. Let's that. Now I'm going to put some crunchy chords in. Right, okay, I like that. Now I'm going to write a melody over the top, which is very much how I approach improvisation, actually, which is sort of the opposite way round to how you're sort of saying you approach it, which is interesting, isn't it? It's two ways of achieving, a similar sort of thing, which is good. When you're thinking about harmony and chords, does that come? Because again, when I compose, I'll tend to write contrafact compositions, which is a new melody over an existing chord change. You can't copyright chord changes, so jazz musicians tend to write new melodies over standard changes like they like to play. A really obvious one is if I've got rhythm changes, which there must be, goodness me, about 40 or 50 different contrafact heads or tunes that you can play over, including the Flintstones and things like that. So nearly every jazz player has written a contrafact over rhythm changes. So I tend to think about the melody over the chords. When you're writing your chords, what gives you the sort of juice to it? Is that led by the melody, or do you think actually I want to create a bit of dissonance and tension and resolution, and how do you go about that? Because surely you're not just sort of writing diatonic kind of
No,
changes.
and I think a lot of the time it's exactly what you say there. It's creating that tension, and tension can come from the melody line, but actually a lot of the time it comes from what's going on underneath. And what one of my favorite things to do is kind of, so for example, let's say I'm starting on a B flat major chord, for example, and I've voiced it with the D in the top, so the third in the top, and I love the idea of kind of a continued note going through the harmony, and that kind of constant line, and everything else moves around it. And
That what you're describing there, if you take a 1-3-5, so B flat D F, and you take that D there and you stick it on the top like that,
yeah,
it's called an open chord, isn't it?
yeah,
Which Bach was a huge fan of.
yeah,
Bach's done it all before us.
yeah, absolutely.
And I use open chords a lot in my improvisation because it voices the chords in a different manner.
It's so much more powerful. I always think it's so much more powerful having that root and fifth at the bottom create real power, and then the third being voiced higher, and kind of the so if we were doing a hierarchy of chord tones for me, so your root is your most important because it's the foundation of the chord. The third is then the second most important because it gives you the quality of the chord. Is it major? Is it minor? And then the fifth is the least important of the three, but it's the second most important in relation to the root because it gives that distance between the root and the fifth gives a chord a real power, and then having the third on top. But I love this idea of finding common tones between chords, and those common tones don't have to be within the triad. So it might be, for example, I don't know. So let's say I'm in B flat again, and I'm going B flat to F, and I might keep that D in. So at the top, so the D isn't in the chord of F; it will be the sixth. But actually having that either as an alteration, so instead of the fifth, instead of the C, or an addition as well as the C, just creates that extra little bit of kind of juiciness. And
you get a little rub, don't you, before it resolves, if that's indeed
that's where you go.
Yeah. When I'm improvising, one of the most important things for me is to try and connect the chords up. So using those two chords you suggested there, B flat and F, if I was playing my solo and on the end of the bar of B flat I ended on a D, I might then drop that D down to the C to the fifth, onto the next chord. So I'm looking at, I've got a sort of designated set of chords, and then I'm weaving my way through them, navigating how I link up each chord. And I think because I'm working with a rhythm section a lot, the root I don't need to worry about too much because the double bass player is playing that. The third is a very important note. I'm trying to hit that, like I say, it gives it the tonality. The fifth, I'm not too worried about. But then I'll look at extensions, particularly the seventh and the ninth, which is again the diatonic extensions before we even think about kind of flattening the five or sharpening the five or moving any other note around or approaching chord tones from a semitone away, either below or above. And my melodies tend to be quite chromatic because of the style in which I improvise in. So we're always hitting those important chord tones, but we're approaching them from chromatic approach notes or sort of surround notes, little clusters.
I think I was going to say that there's two things on that. There was, as a bass player, one of the things I think about is the alteration you can have by subverting the root of the chord. So say we take, for example, that B flat to F progression we were talking about before. What happens if instead of B flat to F, we go to B flat, the bass goes from B flat to A. So still a note in the chord, but it's completely changing then the feel of the chord and the language that's going on. And what you were talking about just then just reminds me of an anecdote. Now it's escaping me, the jazz piano player that I'm thinking of here. But I was reading a thing about him, and he was saying when he improvises, he avoided like traditional chord tones, so the root, the third, and the fifth, and focused on just the extensions.
Sounds
The
like,
idea,
it wasn't Thelonious Monk, was it?
it might have been.
Yeah, sounds like something he'd play. Yeah.
Yeah, but the idea being that he was then operating in a space where the rhythm section weren't. He was playing stuff that wasn't being played by the bass player, maybe wasn't being voiced by the guitarist in the chord that they were playing, and that kind of, but also comping as well.
Using those upper extensions of the chord. Yeah, I mean that's where Charlie Parker moved jazz on, because all the other guys before then were playing within the chord structure, very much so. And then Charlie Parker came and delivered the same ideas, but within the upper extensions of the chord and the upper harmony, and suddenly it becomes sounding very hip, and very different to the kind of 1920s, 30s, and the 30s swing style. Suddenly you get the birth then in the 40s of bop, and you've got this sort of these lovely sort of lines that are still connected to the chord, but in the upper harmony.
Yeah.
One of the things I really enjoy doing as an improvising musician is playing different changes to the rhythm section. So, I mean, we joked about this as we were talking before this about tritone substitution, the devil's interval, the tritone, and that when you substitute a written chord for a different chord, it throws up all sorts of different colours and options to play over, and it can create a real dissonance, especially if the rhythm section are playing the standard changes. So on a dominant chord 5 of the piece, you could play a tritone substitution on that. So say we're in C, chord 5 G. Rather than improvising over a G chord, you find a tritone from that, which is the flattened fifth. I'm rushing through that. I'm sure if people don't know what a tritone sub is, go and book a lesson with me and Adam. But anyway, you can play a substituted chord, and a tritone substitution is great. It's built off the flattened fifth of the dominant chord. So the rhythm section would play a G, and you can play over in D flat. And that sounds really great. If it comes from a 2-5-1 progression, you can sub the 2, and then you sound like John Coltrane, because you sub 2, you sub 5, and you get this dissonance, and a resolution on the 1. And it can sound quite outside, but it's not, because we're just playing nonsense. I mean, we are making it up as we go along, but we're not playing nonsense that doesn't fit. We've made a really clear intention to substitute those chords for different chords for a certain effect. Do you ever do that with your melody composing? If you've composed a melody first, you sort of think, well, that would fit with this chord, but actually, I'm going to substitute that for that. Or
I do it a lot more.
Do you harmonise anything or anything?
I do it. I probably do it a lot more when I'm arranging than I do when I'm composing, and I think it comes from the idea of when you're arranging, the melody is like, to nick a term from Berlioz, an E-day fix. It's a fixed idea, but I've always treated the harmony underneath the melody as kind of, well, that's free game. If we keep the melody the same, we can kind of do whatever we want with the harmony underneath within. So one of my favorite ones is if we're in a major key, so very quickly we'd have 3 major chords and 3 minor chords. So chord 1, chord 4, and chord 5. So if we're in C, F, and G, they'd be major chords. And our other chords, chord 2, chord 6, chord 2, chord 3, chord 6, would be minor. Chord 7 is diminished. We won't talk about it. It's like the ugly stepchild. But I love using the major chord 3 because you get the leading tone. So, for example, or the leading tone of the relative minor. But you get this lovely kind of so dissonance demands resolution, and dissonance when it's a semitone apart, and particularly when it's a semitone apart outside of the key signature, rarely demands resolution. So if you're in C major and you play an E major chord, your ear is like, please play an A, because A is in the key where I want to go. And it really kind of, and I love kind of, particularly with arrangements, again, that idea of playing around with the bass line and kind of going, okay, that's where it normally goes. What happens if we do this?
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that the entire of of Western music is based on dissonance and resolution.
Absolutely.
And the power of the semitone cannot be underestimated for creating angst and passion and anything else. And even when you get into kind of Schoenberg and things like that, the 12-note tone row, it's still about the harmony and the dissonance. And then people talk about jazz harmony. And jazz harmony, it's a big conspiracy. Jazz harmony doesn't exist. You know, a tritone substitution was invented by Scarlatti.
Concepts.
Yeah, it's a Neapolitan sixth. You know, it's all happened before. It's just we're sort of discussing it in different ways. Sometimes I find with jazz musicians, particularly beginning improvisers, and to be honest, sometimes myself, I have a habit of overplaying. So I play far too much just because I've got all these ideas and I try and spill them out all at the same time, rather than thinking, well, for my first chorus, I'm going to do this, then I'll build it and I'll do that. And saxophone players are terribly guilty of just playing lots of notes because, you know, we wheel our fingers and play loads of notes. So I have to be very careful when I'm improvising and about not overplaying. Actually, you know, the whole idea of less is more is a really good thing, unless you want to give a chorus of everything, in which case it's done with intent and for effect. When you're composing, do you ever find you have to hold back and say, hang on, I'm putting that one back in the toolbox until I'm ready to use it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often sketch before I come to like writing full pieces, and I'll sketch and I'll go, do you know what? Let's hold that back until the next time we hear that idea, and let's hold that back. I did, you know, I'm
back to the structure sequence pattern, doesn't it, of development?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an improviser, but I did a workshop with Steve Berry years ago when I was still in secondary school, and so he made us all take these, you know, 16-bar solos. So I did, and he stopped me after about 3 bars, and we're like, if you keep doing that, you're going to pass out. You know, you need space. You need to give your you space, because A, you're a trombone player, it gives you time to breathe. B, it gives you time to actually think about your musical ideas before you get there. And C, it gives your listener a chance to actually comprehend what's come before as well.
I always talk about space, about when you're having a conversation. And if someone's talking to you like this, even though what they're saying is really, really good and useful, and it might be life-changing advice, if they keep talking all the time and never pause for breath, you just switch off, don't you? You just say, I'm not listening to that. And, you know, I look around the room in case there's some John Coltrane fans here. I don't like late John Coltrane. It's too busy for me. You know, I can appreciate the technical demands of it. Do I sing it when I'm in the shower? Absolutely not. You know, and does it have the same kind of effect on me as other saxophone players? Definitely not. You know, it can be too much, can't it? It could be too full on.
And if you know, there's loads of, like, you know, there's really out like Brian Fernyhough and you know, people like that who wrote intentionally dense music, and after a point it becomes an exercise in what you're able to do.
Yes. Rather than what you should do.
Rather than what you should do. And you know, I've never wanted to compose music, and I always try and compose from the point of view of a performer. You know, I always think about, actually, is what I'm asking this person to do, you know, realistic within the realms of the instrument? You know, if they're a wind player, particularly, like, are they physically capable of playing that line to a way that I would want it to be heard? You know, and if not, then what do I need to do to that line to make it, you know, fit that instrument better?
Yeah, I suppose I improvise differently on different instruments. And I don't know whether that's because of a technical thing with how the instrument feels to play, or whether it's because of the way I've just sort of got my gigs. And on clarinet, I tend to play 20s style stuff. And on the sax, I tend to play more swing style stuff. I don't do a great deal of funk. I've certainly never really done much funk clarinet, you know. And then when I play flute, it tends to be on some sort of Latin number, and it's got that kind of vibe, and it all feels maybe a little stereotypical. And sometimes I like to play clarinet on a mainstream gig, or do something different. But generally, I sort of have a certain style associated with the instrument I'm playing. Does your compositional style change? depending on maybe if you're writing for brass band or wind band or choir or whatever you
Either yes and no.
That's an excellent answer. Thanks
I
very
know.
much.
You're welcome. It was good, wasn't it? I talked about fence sitting. I think you're always going to have, and I think this is true for improvisation as well. There's always going to be key stylistic traits that are common to you across everything that you do, and I think you could pick up John Coltrane's saxophone, and you'd still sound like you. And the musical ideas that would come out wouldn't change. And you might play, you might improvise in a 1920s style versus a 40s 50s big band style, but there's still going to be little things in there melodically, harmonically that are.
You have your stylistic kind of pointers, don't you? And that's something I want to talk about in a moment, actually. But one of the things I like to do is, I've played many transcriptions of saxophone soloists, loads of transcribed solos from many saxophone players and clarinetists for that matter. But what I quite enjoy doing is playing transcribed solos from trumpet players, because they approach things completely differently than a saxophone player would. So, I've been playing a lot of Wynton Marsalis and Miles Davis transcriptions, and they just place notes in different places than I would as a saxophone player because of how it fits.
I was going to say, based on the demand. I had a thought before as well. When you improvise, so let's say you're doing a big band chart and you're on alto.
Yeah.
And you then take a solo on clarinet.
Yes.
Are you thinking, how do you, so if I ever improvise, I'm thinking in concert pitch.
Yeah.
So do you improvise? When you improvise, are you thinking about the key of the instrument that you're playing in, or do you think about it in concert pitch?
I think about the chords I'm playing, so therefore my own key of whatever instrument I'm playing on in that time. I know some jazz musicians do think completely in concert pitch and just sort of transpose as they go. I don't. I actually strangely hear things in B flat.
Right.
So if I listen to a piece of music, I can probably tell you what key it's in, but I do that by hearing it as if I'm going to play it on my tenor or my clarinet, and then I transpose it back into concert pitch to verbalise what key is that in. So I'll go, oh yeah, it's in G. I mean concert F, for me. So my ears have developed in B flat, which is a bit weird, but I think it's just because I've played in B flat since I was 6 years old.
Yeah.
So that's 12 years now. So yeah, having sort of acclimatized to the world of B flat, I think I do it like that. But I also, and often people say, because obviously I play all the saxes and the clarinet and flute, people say, well, which one's your favourite? And I say, the one I'm playing at the moment. So if I'm playing a clarinet, I'm a clarinetist. If I'm playing tenor sax, I'm a tenor sax player. If I'm playing barry sax, I'm barry sax player. And I kind of, because they're all so vastly different as well. So I sort of get that head on. But you're right, whatever instrument I'm playing, you can still tell it's me playing it.
Yeah.
And that's I think the really good thing about developing a personal sound. So you listen to a record and I know what my favourite players sound like. I can recognise them straight away from their tone, their style, the way they phrase, the little riffs and licks they've got that often come back, the little trademark kind of motifs. And I think composers have that as well. If we think of one that we'll all know, Hans Zimmer, Pirates of the Caribbean, you hear it all the time through his work, don't you? And in all the different film scores, you get bits of that coming back. And I think it's testament to the composer if somebody listens to a piece by Adam Dutch and goes, that sounds like it's by Adam Dutch. So do you find that you get like somebody listening to me play would go, that's Phil playing the saxophone, that is. Do you think they'd listen to one of your pieces of music and say, that sounds like one that Adam's written?
I think there will be certain things that you kind of go, that's very stylish. So again, Sarah and I were talking about this before, this idea of you reach a climax, and then so think the middle movement to 3 states of change.
I know exactly what you say. I love this. But it is a very Adam Dutch thing. Yeah.
But it is. It's here's your climax. Oh, nothing happens on beat one apart from this one solitary thing, and then everything's going to come in halfway through the bar. And it's that kind of, it's almost that denial of resolution. It's extending that kind of, that thing a little bit longer.
It draws the audience in, doesn't it? Because it makes you wait for it. It's good. It's not giving it all away. Ta-da! Is it?
No. And I think it's a little bit like when you train to be a teacher, you learn what your vocal tick is. So everybody's got one, and so mine is right. I'm really guilty of saying right when I'm teaching. And as soon as you know it, you're really conscious of every time you do it. And it's very similar with like a compositional trait. Once you've worked out what your compositional trait is, it's almost embarrassing, because you'll go back and listen to stuff and go, oh God, it's absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
And so you then become conscious of not using it all the time. And you only do that. That's, I suppose, one big difference and one big drawback you've got compositionally. Improvisationally, you might improvise on, say, doing a big band gig, you might improvise on 5-6 charts a night and have the opportunity to develop ideas and build through them, whatever. Composers might compose 5-6 pieces a year. And then, those skills take a lot longer to develop. And, if you want to go back and change something, it's a lot of time and effort. And someone once said to me that, no one ever finishes a piece of art. They just abandon it. And I think that's true of great painters and great pieces of music. And at some point, you've got to just leave your piece alone and move on. But it doesn't stop you listening back to it and going, oh God, I just want to do this.
I'd done that. Yeah. I mean, obviously, most of my gigs really tend to be sort of small band jazz stuff. So I'm playing chorus after chorus after chorus, developing these ideas. But I also have to have a big toolbox of vocabulary. A huge amount of vocabulary that I could use, because otherwise every tune I play would sound the same. You'd sound like you're playing the same solo over everything. So, you have to be careful not to overuse ideas. So that's where developing both vocabularies, compositional and a sort of improvisatory vocabulary comes in very, very important. You've got to be able to draw these in. It's nearly 8:45, would you believe?
Oh.
And for everybody listening, we've got the option to join in with the Zoom chat and type us a message in. So although you can hear us, we can't hear you. But if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask based on what Adam and I have been chatting about, if you type them into the Zoom group chat now, and we'll try and get to them sort of in real time before we go. When you're developing your vocabulary, do you sort of have standard little phrases or licks or anything that you particularly like? I know you've mentioned that technique of hitting on two, but have you only got any like melodic things? Because if you listen to jazz improvisers play, you hear them play something, you think, gosh, that is very Stan Getz, or that is very Scott Hamilton. He does that all the time. And then as I listen to these improvisers play, I will kind of emulate what they're doing, so I make no secret of the fact that Scott Hamilton's my favourite tenor player. And I really try and play as much as I can like him. And of course, I'll never sound like him, but I've developed my own sound through pinching bits of his stuff, bits of Stan Getz's stuff, bits of Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, all my sort of favourite players. Do you pinch bits from other composers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, as I say pinch, I mean emulate, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, melodically, I would, well, not even just that. John Williams, I would consider to be the greatest living composer. And
who was also an exceptionally good jazz pianist.
Absolutely.
And a great improviser.
And if there's a film he did called The Terminal, which was released in, I think, 2000.
Oh, great, with the clarinet.
Victor. And some of the jazz piano on that is just it's beautiful. Yeah, but his melody writing is incredible, because the majority of the time when he's writing a melody, he will just use the root, the third and fifth of the chord. He's not his harmonic language melodic language when he's developing a melody is not expansive, but it's so memorable. And that's one of my things when I come to writing melody in particular. I do start with this idea of I'm going to use use just chord tones, apart from maybe halfway through a phrase when I might finish the bar on a dissonance that is, and I'm a big fan as well of like this, of holding a dissonance over a bar. So, for example, I don't know, holding a B over from a C major 7 chord to an F chord, so you get that sharp 4 in the F chord.
Yeah.
But having that highlighted in the melody line. So, melodically for me, that's an absolutely massive one.
Have you emulated that from somebody else's style, or is that a really original thing? Or
the dissonance? Do you know what? I think it comes a lot from jazz.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking in my head then. The God Bless the Child. If you think when you get to like bar 4 of that melody, where it stays on that sustained note and what the chords do underneath, I think that kind of the jazz ballad kind of style, particularly kind of post 1940.
So mid-50s kind of. 54 to 59 sort of thing. Yeah.
When you also got kind of use of like show tunes as well. So I was going to say that's another one. Musical theatre is another place where that harmonic language comes from. But that kind of intersection of jazz and musical theatre and that kind of writing really influences, and that obviously draws on loads of other influences that have come before as well.
All the time, don't you? One of the things I say to students of improvisation is, if you hold a note, whatever note it is, it might be a chord tone for that particular chord, it might be a dissonance. If you just hold that right the way through, like a pedal or an inverted pedal as a composer would think of it, perhaps, and it stays, and that note stays the same, but then the harmony around it changes, the note's function changes, and the flavour of it changes. So it might be the third here, but then it becomes the fifth there, then it becomes the flattened seventh there, and suddenly it's developing this completely different flavour all the way along as the harmony changes around it. And you've done nothing clever, you've just held a note, but suddenly it's changed its function.
A really good example of that is the end of Music of the Night in Phantom of the Opera, where singing that E flat, and underneath you get these 5 chords that, until you get to the penultimate 5-1, make no sense whatsoever. It's like
it's a dissonance all the way through.
And it's not even like a functional dissonance. It's like, well, that's a sharp 13. That's it's exactly. Like
that's really. And that almost feels random, but of course everything can be analysed, and you can say, well, that's a G minor sharp 6 chord or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not until you get to that kind of literally the cadence point that it goes, oh, and this all makes sense. But by having that resolution, all of a sudden the last 4 bars retroactively now make sense, because as a listener you're going, where the hell is this going? And sometimes it's really nice to just kind of go, you know what, we're gonna go on a little bit of a ride here, and it's gonna all make sense when we get to that cadence point.
And the key with both things, with composition and improvisation, to create that feel of almost sort of randomness, it has been done with complete intent. It's done with intent. It's not a happy accident. It's been thought about carefully and created like that. So we've got a question from Mal to finish us off with then. When playing in smaller ensembles, a really enjoyable thing is playing a counter melody. How much thought and in what circumstances do you include that? I think I'll just take that from a jazz point of view and an improviser's point of view for a moment, if I may, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I'm playing with a 2-horn front line or playing with a singer, I'll often, and I'm not playing the melody, I'll often improvise a counter melody around the melody that's going on. And actually that's a very different improvisational technique. It's a very different way of playing, and I would imagine it's a very different way of composing. You think about how you're going to complement the melody with it and fill in the gaps and the spaces, rather than actually creating just another melody that's going to run alongside and kind of get in each other's way. You know, I've worked with a lot of singers, and if I played all over what they were singing, they'd be really a bit annoyed. You know, in fact, that happened to Charlie Parker. I forget who he was playing, but he was behind some singer playing as a young guy, you know, probably about 16, 17, playing all these fast bebop licks. And the singer sacked him and said, "You can't play that behind me. I'm trying to sing a ballad here." And he's going, blah, 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 blah. And the other sort of great jazz counter melody idea is Jerry Mulligan with Chet Baker and the pianoless quartet. So baritone sax, trumpet, double bass, and drums. So there's no harmony going in there. There's no harmony instrument. They have to create the harmony themselves by playing accompaniment parts or long notes occasionally in middle eights and things. And you get this very fugal texture, which is just a delight. And often, you know, maybe if I'm playing in the quartet, I'll maybe play some long notes to kind of spell out the harmony under the bass solo or something like that, which again gives that kind of counter melody feel. But yeah, it's very different to what we've been discussing about the melodic sort of development within composition and improvisation.
Though when I'm composing, I do try. So I always think you can either think when you're composing vertically, so think in terms of chords, or you can think horizontally in terms of melody line. And I do try as much as I can to think horizontally, so that every line to a certain extent is melodic. Because I've played loads of arrangements where you go in, why am I jumping like a tenth?
Long note there, long note there, long note there.
Yeah. And that's another thing as well that's really key to my composition, is that like the easiest way to compose is to have the least distance travel between notes. It's going to sound the least jarring. But you're absolutely right in terms of kind of coming up with a compelling counter melody. It's happening in the space between everything else that's going on, because you don't want to have I should say just another melody line that's going to be like battering someone around the head with it. It's like, listen to this, you know,
just getting in the way.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. You know, it needs to be something that's kind of, it's going to fill in that space and kind of draw the listener's ear away from where the melody goes. If I'll be really egotistical for a second and use an example of mine for a second, Mountains of Morn, the little horn bit, da da da, which is in the gap in a flute melody.
That's right, yeah.
It just comes in for one bar and then goes away, and it's not there anymore. You know, and adding those moments in when the texture's thicker is trickier to do. But I always try and think when I'm composing to try and write, you know, I try not to write a line. And me and Mal have actually had this conversation before about playing bass lines. And I think it's one of those things that I love playing a bass line. And I think it comes from doing it, you know, my entire life.
The bottom end of the band, yeah.
You know, you either love that idea or you're like, this is really dull. And I love it because it's like, you're creating the foundation of the ensemble. But all of the lines I do try to an extent to go, if I was playing this, do I think this is melodically interesting myself? Do I think that I might be playing the melody line? And
perhaps when you're thinking about a bass line in that way, you maybe don't just go bomb, 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 bomb. You think, well, how are you going to move between those notes? Yeah. Because if you were actually a bass player, you'd be going dum, 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 digga dum, boom, 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 beam, boom, digga digga dum, boom. You know, depending on how your bass skills are. I don't think they're the exact right fingerings.
Not the right fingering, but close.
Yeah, you sort of think about, well, what is that going to go, and not just kind of leave it to the last bit, do you? So I suppose I've got two questions for you as a composer to finish off with. And the first one is, do you ever improvise to come up with compositional ideas? I know you said before, I'm not an improviser. And by that, I imagine you mean you don't want to stand up with a jazz quartet and rattle through 2 sets of playing improvised jazz. But would you use improvisation as a key way of coming up with compositional ideas?
Yes. The only thing I'm a bit hesitant to do is I find sometimes I can be limited. So, for instance, if I do it at the piano, because I'm not particularly a pianist, I can sometimes be limited by my own technical kind of ability. Yeah. What I'm more likely to do, though, and I do this regularly, is play the accompaniment part on the piano and then improvise either in my head or actually sing the melody line.
Say, do you sing? Because I sing solos before I play them.
Oh yeah.
Actually, I can sing a much better solo than I can play.
I can sing a far better solo than I can play.
And occasionally you get those magic moments on stage where exactly what's in your head is coming out of the horn. It doesn't happen all the time, and it's definitely taken 20 years of really hard study on improvisation. But at that point, occasionally, what's in my head comes out of my saxophone, and I'm finding that's happening more and more and more. And I think as you get more sort of developed as an improviser and more developed as a composer, you know, you can sing something in your head. You don't even need to play it on the just goes down on the manuscript, you know. And I think that connection is the same, isn't it? That sort of motor neurological connection in the brain between what we want it to sound like and whether it's going to come out on stage in real time or whether it's going to come out onto the manuscript in real time. You know, I mean, I have watched composers go write that down, and that'll put that chord, that's great, you know, and then they play it and wow, that's exactly what you've just sung. And I think that's when those moments happen, that's a real highlight, both for an improviser and a composer, isn't it? You know, when you go, that's it, that's what's in my head. Really, really nice. And just to finish with, you know, I've talked about Scott Hamilton being my sort of favourite jazz improviser. Who would you say is it John Williams then, who's had the biggest sort of compositional influence on you?
I would say probably so John Williams, Eric Whittaker, particularly when I was younger, when I was about 18, 19 and just discovering kind of his choral legs. I find as well, like the composers I really like are gateway composers. So I like Eric Whittaker because he introduced me to a whole different world of kind of, you know, that harmonic language and you know, Morton Loudus and all that kind of thing. But he was the person who kind of got me into that. John Williams was the person who probably got me into kind of, you know, film scoring. Philip Spark was the person who got me into, you know, wind band composing and arranging. So I've always said, like, I tend to, and this is probably one of the big differences, I think, maybe from a composer and an improviser. I have got favourite pieces, but I've not got many favourite composers. And I find that, like, I'll pick and choose things from kind of composers' kind of catalogues and go, that's amazing, I really like that, why is that really good? Rather than their whole work.
Yeah, that's exactly, right. Yeah. I mean, like I was saying before, I love John Coltrane, but only to about 1962.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, and then you pick and choose, and that all goes into the melting pot. And you develop your own voice, don't you?
Yeah. And I mean, you know, there's more music in the world than we could possibly listen to, and the only thing that you're going to do by listening to more is learn more. And I'm now going back and listening to, like, you know, more Mozart and Bach and stuff like that, and stuff that I didn't listen to 10 years ago, but now I'm listening to and appreciating in a completely different way.
I think the one thing we could probably agree on is the best way to develop as a musician, a composer, and an improviser is to listen. Actively listen and engage in as much music as possible. And I think that's a really nice sentiment to finish on. So a big thanks to Chris Horswood for doing all the tech stuff tonight and making all the magic of Zoom work. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in to have a listen. If you're watching on the Facebook page in the future, thanks for recapping and seeing us. We look less like this now. And mainly, big thanks to our guest tonight, Adam Dutch.
Cheers, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure, mate. Pleasure. And thank you, everybody. Stay safe, keep well, and we'll see you soon.